Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot, and love finds us in the most unexpected places. In a world that judges worth by appearance alone, true beauty often hides beneath the surface, waiting for someone wise enough to recognize it. In 1847, the frontier town of Cedar Ridge buzzed with gossip about Silas McGraw's strange choice of bride. The mountain man everyone called Grizzly had picked Mildred Harper, the plainest woman in 3 counties. Folks laughed and shook their heads, certain the giant had lost his mind. They saw only her simple dress and quiet ways. But Silas knew something they didn't. He had glimpsed the fire burning behind her gentle eyes and the steel hidden in her soft voice. What could transform a town's mockery into stunned silence on a single wedding night? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Ridge, perched on the edge of civilization, like a stubborn mule refusing to budge. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beyond its weathered buildings, where mountains clawed at pewter skies and valleys held secrets older than memory. In this harsh land of 1847, survival demanded more than pretty faces and gentle manners. It required grit, wisdom, and the kind of inner strength that couldn't be bought at any general store. The town itself wore its roughness like a badge of honor. Main Street consisted of little more than packed dirt between 2 rows of wooden buildings that groaned with every winter wind. Henderson's general store anchored one end, its false front painted white but already peeling from the relentless mountain weather. At the other end stood Murphy's Saloon, where most of the town's business, both legitimate and otherwise, found its way to completion over shots of whiskey and hands of poker. Between these landmarks sat the barbershop, the blacksmith's forge with its eternal orange glow, and Miss Adelaide's boarding house for travelers brave enough or foolish enough to venture this far into the wilderness. The church, a modest structure with a crooked steeple that the carpenter had sworn would straighten with time, occupied a small rise overlooking the main thoroughfare. Time had proven the carpenter wrong about many things. In this unforgiving place, social standing mattered as much as anywhere else, perhaps more so. The hierarchy revealed itself in subtle ways. Who got served first at Henderson's counter, whose credit was good when times grew lean, whose opinions carried weight when disputes arose. At the top sat Judge Hartwell and his wife Margaret, followed by the more prosperous merchants and ranchers. Below them, the working folk, blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, carved out their modest places with steady hands and honest labor. And then there was Silas McGraw, who existed entirely outside this carefully constructed social order, standing 6 feet 4 inches in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that could snap a man's neck as easily as kindling. Silas commanded a respect born of equal parts fear and admiration. His beard, streaked with premature silver at 32, hung thick and wild down his chest. Deep-set brown eyes, sharp as winter morning, missed nothing that moved within his sight. When he walked down Main Street, which happened rarely, conversations stopped and children scattered like leaves before a storm. They called him Grizzly, not just for his size, but for the way he lived. His cabin sat high in the mountains, accessible only by treacherous trails that would challenge a mountain goat. He came to town perhaps once a month, always alone, to trade furs for supplies. His reputation preceded him like morning mist. Stories of single-handedly driving off a pack of wolves, of tracking a wounded bear through 3 days of blizzard, of appearing like a ghost when travelers found themselves lost in the high country. The knife he wore at his belt had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. The blade, though nicked and scarred from decades of use, held its edge like the day it was forged. The handle, wrapped in worn leather, darkened by countless hands, fit his palm as if it had grown there. This knife had carved shelter from wilderness, prepared game for survival, and on more than one occasion defended life against both animal and human predators. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, those who bothered to look closely, and few did, might have noticed something else in Silas McGraw. The way he always paid his debts promptly and fairly, how he never took more than he needed, never cheated on a trade. The gentleness with which he handled injured animals brought to him by desperate travelers. Children might scatter at his approach, but he never raised his voice or made threatening gestures. He simply existed as a force of nature, as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. Then there was Mildred Harper, who occupied an entirely different place in Cedar Ridge's social architecture. At 28, she remained unmarried, in a place where women rarely reached 20 without a husband. This fact alone marked her as different, though not necessarily in a way that drew admiration. Mildred worked as the town's seamstress, her small shop tucked between the barber shop and a vacant lot where ambitious flowers struggled against the harsh climate. Her appearance seemed designed to avoid notice. Mouse-brown hair pulled back severely, from a face that could charitably be called plain. Her dresses, always clean but never stylish, hung loosely on her slight frame. She wore no jewelry, save for a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother, a woman whose beauty, according to local legend, had once turned heads from Cedar Ridge to Helena. How such a lovely woman had produced such an unremarkable daughter remained one of the town's enduring mysteries. Some whispered that grief had stolen Mildred's looks when consumption claimed her mother. Others suggested that disappointment in love had withered her before she'd had a chance to bloom. The truth, as truth often is, proved more complicated than gossip allowed. Mildred possessed skills that served the community well. Her needlework surpassed anything available for 200 miles in any direction. She could take rough homespun and transform it into garments that wouldn't shame their wearers in more civilized places. Wives brought her their husbands' worn work clothes to be mended with invisible stitches. Young women saved their coins to have wedding dresses crafted by her careful hands. Yet despite her usefulness, Mildred remained peripheral to the town's social life. She attended church services but sat in the back. She shopped for necessities but lingered for no gossip at the counter. Invitations to quilting circles and church socials rarely found their way to her door, and when they did, she usually declined with polite, soft-spoken excuses. Those who bothered to engage her in conversation, and again few did, might have discovered a quick intelligence behind her quiet manner. She read voraciously, borrowing books from the preacher's small library and somehow acquiring others through means unknown. Her knowledge of subjects ranging from medicine to literature often surprised those who assumed her learning matched her appearance. But in a place where survival often depended on immediate judgments, most people saw only what they expected to see. A plain spinster who served a useful function but hardly merited deeper consideration. The supporting cast of Cedar Ridge filled their roles with the consistency of actors who'd performed the same play for years. Henderson at the general store, round and balding, dispensed goods and gossip with equal enthusiasm. His wife, Ruth, thin as a willow switch and twice as sharp, managed the store's books and most of the town's moral judgments. Murphy, the Irish saloon keeper, poured drinks and collected secrets with the skill of a professional confessor. Judge Hartwell, appointed by territorial authority but elected by local respect, maintained order through a combination of legal knowledge and practical wisdom. His wife, Margaret, led the town's social activities with the efficiency of a military commander. Dr. Whitmore, when sober, could set bones and deliver babies as well as any physician between the Missouri and the Pacific. When drunk, he philosophized about the futility of fighting death in a land determined to kill its inhabitants. The preacher, Reverend Samuel Clearwater, had arrived 3 years earlier with a calling to bring salvation to the frontier. A young man with earnest eyes and Eastern education, he approached his ministry with the dedication of someone who believed words could triumph over wilderness. His sermons often addressed the need for Christian charity and looking beyond surface appearances, ironies that would soon become apparent to all. This, then, was the world into which the news of Silas McGraw's courtship fell like a boulder into a still pond. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the last snows had finally released their grip on the high passes. Silas had descended from his mountain stronghold on one of his regular supply runs, but instead of conducting his usual business and departing, he made his way to Mildred's small shop. Those who witnessed his approach later claimed they'd never seen the mountain man look uncertain about anything, yet he paused outside her door for a full minute, his massive frame filling the morning shadow before finally entering. The conversation that followed remained private, but its result soon became public knowledge. By afternoon, word had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire through dry grass. Silas Grizzly McGraw, the most feared and respected man in 3 territories, had asked for Mildred Harper's hand in marriage. Even more shocking, she had accepted. The reaction proved as swift as it was merciless. In Murphy's saloon, men slapped the bar and roared with laughter. At Henderson's store, women whispered behind their hands and shook their heads in amazement. Even children seemed to sense the adults' excitement, clustering in doorways to catch fragments of the incredible news. "That mountain man's finally lost his mind," declared Bill Henderson, his belly shaking with mirth. "Living alone up there too long, I'd say." "Poor old Grizzly," added Tom Murphy, polishing a glass with theatrical sympathy. "Must be getting desperate. He for company to settle for the likes of her." The women proved no kinder in their assessments. "I suppose even Mildred Harper looks good to a man who's been staring at pine trees for months," sniffed Margaret Hartwell. "Though what she sees in him I cannot imagine." Ruth Henderson, never one to be outdone in matters of social observation, offered her expert opinion. "Mark my words, this marriage won't last 6 months. A man like that and a mouse like her. Oil and water, I say." Yet, amid all the laughter and speculation, a few thoughtful individuals wondered if perhaps there was more to this unlikely pairing than met the eye. Judge Hartwell, stroking his grey beard, reminded his wife that Silas McGraw had never been known to make foolish decisions. Dr. Whitmore, in one of his clearer moments, observed that still waters often ran deeper than anyone suspected. And Reverend Clearwater, though he kept his thoughts largely to himself, found himself reflecting on his own sermons about the danger of judging by appearances. He had preached often about looking beyond the surface to find the true worth of a person's character. Now it seemed the frontier would provide a test of whether anyone had been listening. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge that evening, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings, the town settled into sleep with the satisfaction of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. They had gossip to last through the winter, a story to tell travelers, and the delicious anticipation of watching this improbable romance play out before their eyes. None of them suspected that their entertainment would soon become their education, or that the plain seamstress and the fearsome mountain man would teach them lessons about courage, loyalty, and the true nature of beauty that would reshape their understanding of human worth. The stage was set, the players introduced, and the first act of an extraordinary drama about to begin. The morning after the announcement brought a different kind of weather to Cedar Ridge. Spring sunshine filtered through gathering clouds, creating patches of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the town's conflicted mood. While most residents reveled in their newfound entertainment, the objects of their amusement faced the harsh reality of public scrutiny. Mildred Harper discovered this firsthand when she opened her shop to find 3 women waiting outside like vultures circling carrion. Margaret Hartwell led the delegation, flanked by Ruth Henderson and Sarah Whitmore, the doctor's wife. Their faces wore expressions of manufactured concern that fooled no one, least of all Mildred. "My dear," Margaret began with false sweetness, "we simply had to come and discuss this extraordinary news. Surely you haven't given proper thought to what you're considering." Mildred's fingers found the small silver locket at her throat, a gesture so subtle the women missed its significance. Inside that tarnished piece of jewelry lay a daguerreotype of her mother, Eleanor Harper, whose beauty had once captivated men from the Rockies to the Great Plains. But the locket held more than just a photograph. It contained secrets that would have shocked these gossiping women into permanent silence. "I appreciate your concern," Mildred replied, her voice soft but steady. "But Mr. McGraw and I understand each other quite well." Ruth Henderson snorted with undisguised derision. "Understand each other? Child, that man is practically a wild animal. He lives like a hermit in those mountains, speaks to no one, and heaven knows what kind of life he'd expect you to lead." "A woman needs society," added Sarah Whitmore, warming to the intervention. "You can't possibly be happy isolated up there. With him. Think of your reputation, dear. Think of your future." But Mildred had been thinking of little else since Silas McGraw had entered her shop the previous morning. The memory remained vivid. His massive frame filling her doorway, blocking out the spring sunlight, yet something in his manner suggesting vulnerability rather than threat. He had removed his worn hat and stood there awkwardly, as if uncertain how to begin. His eyes had swept her small shop, taking in the neat rows of thread, the carefully organized fabrics, the half-finished garments hanging from wooden pegs. When his gaze finally settled on her, she had seen something unexpected in those dark depths. "Recognition, Miss Harper," he had said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "I've come to ask you something, and I'd be obliged if you'd hear me out before giving your answer." She had nodded, her hands busy with the mending in her lap, more from nervousness than necessity. "I know what folks think of me," he continued, his hat turning slowly in his large hands. "Mountain man, they say. Grizzly, someone to fear or avoid. And I suppose they're not entirely wrong. I've lived hard, done things that would shock proper people, made choices that left marks on my soul." He paused, studying her face as if reading something written there in a language only he understood. "But I see things others don't, Miss Harper. I see how you care for old Mrs. Patterson when she can't pay for mending. I've watched you leave food on your doorstep for hungry travelers who are too proud to ask. I've seen the books you read, the questions you ask when you think no one's listening." Mildred's needle had stilled in her fingers. No one had ever noticed those small kindnesses, those quiet moments when she thought herself unobserved. "I'm not asking you to love me," Silas had said, his voice growing more confident. "I'm asking you to consider that we might understand each other. Two people who know what it means to be judged by appearances, to be valued for what others think they see rather than who we really are." The proposal itself had been unlike anything she could have imagined. No flowery words about romance or passion, no promises of comfort or security. Instead, he offered something far more precious: understanding. "I have a good cabin, strong walls, supplies enough for winter. The mountains are beautiful if you know how to see them. And Miss Harper—" He had paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I have a feeling you know how to see a great many things that others miss." She had accepted not because she was desperate for marriage, though the town would certainly assume so, but because she recognized in this rough mountain man a kindred spirit, someone else who had learned to hide their true nature behind a carefully constructed facade. Now, facing the concerned expressions of Cedar Ridge's social leaders, Mildred drew strength from that memory and the secret it represented. "Mr. McGraw is a good man," she said simply, "perhaps better than most realize." Margaret Hartwell's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Good? My dear girl, the man is barely civilized. He lives like a savage, speaks to no one, and heaven only knows what kind of wild notions. He has never shown anything but courtesy to me," Mildred interrupted, her quiet voice carrying an edge that made the older woman step back. "Perhaps the question isn't what kind of man he is, but what kind of people we are for assuming the worst without cause." The three women exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by this unexpected show of spirit from the town's most retiring resident. Ruth Henderson recovered first, her thin lips pursing with disapproval. "Well, I never. Mildred Harper, Your poor mother must be spinning in her grave to hear you speak so boldly about a man you barely know." At the mention of her mother, something shifted in Mildred's expression. Her hand tightened on the locket, and for just a moment, these women glimpsed something that made them uncomfortably aware they might have misjudged their target. "My mother," Mildred said with quiet intensity, "taught me to value character over appearance, substance over reputation. She would have approved of my choice." Before the delegation could respond, the shop door opened with enough force to rattle the small bell above it. Silas McGraw stepped inside, his presence immediately transforming the small space. The three women pressed back against the fabric shelves like startled birds. "Ladies," he said with a polite nod that somehow managed to suggest they should leave immediately. Margaret Hartwell gathered her dignity around her like a cloak. "Mr. McGraw, we were just expressing our concerns about this hasty engagement. Surely you can understand—" "I understand that Miss Harper has accepted my proposal," Silas replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that ended arguments before they began. "I also understand that she's perfectly capable of making her own decisions without a committee to guide her." Ruth Henderson bristled. "We're simply looking out for her welfare. She has no family to—" "She has me now," Silas said with finality that brooked no argument. The three women realized they had ventured into territory far beyond their ability to navigate. With a few more sputtered protests about propriety and hasty decisions, they retreated from the shop like a defeated army. When they were gone, Silas turned to Mildred with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I'm sorry about that. I figured they'd come calling, but I hope to spare you the worst of it." "You don't need to apologize," Mildred replied, surprising herself with her own calmness. "I've endured their opinions for 28 years. I suspect I can manage a few more weeks." "About that," Silas said, his expression growing serious. "If you're having second thoughts, are you?" He considered her question with the same careful attention he might give to reading weather signs in the mountains. "No. If anything, what I just saw confirms that I chose well. Most people would have crumbled under that kind of pressure. Most people haven't had my practice at being the subject of disapproval." They stood looking at each other across the small shop, two unlikely allies who had somehow found each other in a world that seemed determined to keep them isolated. Outside, Cedar Ridge buzzed with renewed gossip about the confrontation at the seamstress shop. But inside, surrounded by thread and fabric and the tools of Mildred's quiet trade, something deeper took root between them. "There's something you should know," Mildred said suddenly, her fingers again finding her mother's locket. "About me, I mean. About who I really am." Silas waited patiently while she gathered her courage. "People think I'm just a spinster seamstress who never had any other options. They're wrong." She moved to her workbench and from beneath it withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay documents that would have stunned the town gossips into silence. Letters of recommendation from physicians in San Francisco and Denver, certificates of medical training, and most shocking of all, correspondence from territorial officials requesting her assistance in matters of law enforcement. "My mother wasn't just beautiful," Mildred explained, watching Silas's expression as he examined the papers. "She was brilliant. She made sure I received an education that would have impressed university men. I trained as a healer and learned skills that, well, let's say they've proven useful in unexpected ways." Silas studied the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood the value of hidden truths. When he looked up at her, his eyes held new respect, but no surprise. "I wondered," he said simply. "No one develops your kind of awareness. By accident. The way you notice things, the way you carry yourself when you think no one's watching. I knew there was more to Mildred Harper than met the eye." "You don't seem shocked." "Should I be? I've got my own secrets, things the town would find hard to believe about old Grizzly McGraw." He returned the papers to their box with careful reverence. "Maybe that's why we understand each other. We both know what it's like to be more than people expect." As if to underscore his words, the sound of raised voices drifted through the shop. Window. A crowd had gathered outside Murphy's saloon, their laughter cruel and pointed. Someone had started a betting pool on how long the marriage would last, with odds heavily favoring disaster within the month. Mildred listened to their mockery, with the same patient expression she might wear while enduring a thunderstorm. But Silas felt anger building in his chest like pressure behind a dam. These people knew nothing of struggle or sacrifice, nothing of the strength required to survive in a harsh world. They judged worth by superficial standards and found entertainment in others' misfortune. Let them laugh, Mildred said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Their opinions will matter less when we're building a life together. Her words struck him with unexpected force. This woman, dismissed and underestimated by everyone around her, possessed a core of steel that impressed even him. She faced their ridicule with dignity, their doubts with quiet confidence. In that moment, Silas McGraw realized he had chosen far better than even he had dared hope. "The wedding," he said. "When would you like?" "Soon," she replied, without hesitation. "I see no reason to endure weeks of their speculation and advice." He nodded approvingly. 2 weeks, then. That should give the preacher time to prepare and you time to—" He gestured vaguely at her shop. "Arrange whatever needs arranging." "Mr. McGraw," she said as he prepared to leave. "Silas, are you certain about this? Once we're married, there won't be any going back to your solitary life. You'll have responsibilities, someone else to consider." "Miss Harper," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I've been alone long enough to know the difference between solitude and loneliness. I think we can build something together. That's better than either of us has known alone." After he left, Mildred sat quietly in her shop as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. The locket felt warm against her skin, as if her mother's spirit approved of this unexpected turn in her daughter's life. Outside, Cedar Ridge continued its speculation and gossip, but inside, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the promise of a different future, Mildred Harper allowed herself to hope. The inciting incident had occurred, not just the proposal and acceptance, but the town's reaction and the first glimpse of the hidden depths both bride and groom possessed. The forces that would shape their story had been set in motion, and there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen together. 2 weeks until the wedding. 2 weeks for Cedar Ridge to exhaust itself with speculation. And then the real story would begin. The news of the wedding date spread through Cedar Ridge faster than smoke from a prairie fire. 2 weeks seemed impossibly hasty to a town accustomed to lengthy engagements and elaborate preparations. Yet for those who bothered to observe closely, the announced timeline revealed something telling about both bride and groom. Neither saw any benefit in prolonging their exposure to public scrutiny. Mildred Harper spent the following days in a peculiar mixture of activity and contemplation. Her small shop remained open for business, though fewer customers seemed to require her services, whether from awkwardness about her impending marriage or simple, cruel amusement at watching her prepare for what they viewed as inevitable disaster. The town's women largely avoided her establishment. This isolation might have devastated someone who craved social acceptance, but Mildred found it almost liberating. Without the constant need to deflect questions or endure pointed observations about her choice of husband, she could focus on more important matters. Chief among these was the worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, a leather-bound treasure that held far more than scripture between its pages. Eleanor Harper had possessed an inquiring mind that refused to be confined by conventional wisdom. Her Bible contained pressed flowers from every state she had visited, detailed notes about medicinal properties written in margins beside appropriate verses, and most importantly, observations about human nature that revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychology and behavior. "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart," read one well-worn passage, "and lean not unto thine own understanding." But in the margin, Eleanor had written, "Understanding comes from observation, patience, and the willingness to see beyond surface. Appearances, God helps those who develop wisdom, along with faith. These marginal notes had served as Mildred's true education, teaching her to look deeper than most people bothered to search. Her mother had possessed an almost supernatural ability to read character and motivation, skills she had passed to her daughter through careful instruction disguised as casual conversation. Now, preparing for marriage to a man she barely knew, yet somehow understood, Mildred found herself returning to those lessons. She studied Silas McGraw with the same careful attention her mother had taught her to apply to medicinal plants, looking for hidden properties that might prove either beneficial or dangerous. What she discovered surprised even her trained eye. Despite his fearsome reputation, Silas demonstrated remarkable gentleness in small matters. When he visited her shop to discuss wedding arrangements, he moved carefully around her displays, conscious of his size in the confined space. His voice remained soft when speaking to her, though she had heard it carry clear authority when addressing the interfering women. He asked for her preferences rather than dictating his own, treating her as an equal partner in their planning, despite the era's customs that gave husbands absolute authority. Most telling of all, he listened to her responses, with genuine attention, processing not just her words, but the thoughts behind them. This quality, so rare in her experience that she had almost forgotten it existed, convinced her that their marriage might succeed despite its unconventional beginning. The wedding preparations themselves proved simpler than traditional ceremonies demanded. Mildred had no family to invite, no elaborate trousseau to assemble, no social obligations to fulfill. Instead, she spent her evenings creating a wedding dress that would serve as both personal statement and practical garment. Using fabric she had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive, she crafted a gown of deep blue wool that complemented her complexion without calling undue attention to herself. The design remained modest by necessity. High neckline, long sleeves, simple lines that flattered without attempting to transform. But the craftsmanship revealed her true skills. Every stitch was perfect, every seam invisible, every detail executed with the precision of someone who understood. That excellence lay not in ostentation, but in quiet perfection. The dress would serve her well in the mountains, warm enough for harsh weather, yet beautiful enough to remind both bride and groom that this marriage deserved dignity, regardless of others' opinions. As she worked by lamplight, her fingers moving, with practiced efficiency, Mildred allowed herself to imagine the life awaiting her. Silas had described his mountain cabin with the careful attention of someone who had invested years in creating a refuge from the world's harshness. Strong walls, he had said, good water, adequate supplies, and the kind of peace that came from distance between oneself and civilization's demands. The prospect of such isolation might have terrified a woman accustomed to society, but Mildred found it appealing. She had spent 28 years being observed, judged, and found wanting by people whose own lives showed little evidence of wisdom or compassion. The idea of escaping their scrutiny while building something meaningful with a man who saw her true worth held more attraction than any social advantage. Yet even as she planned for her new life, troubling undercurrents stirred beneath Cedar Ridge's surface gossip. The betting pool at Murphy's saloon had grown more elaborate as word spread to neighboring settlements. Men rode in from ranches 50 miles away to place wagers on various aspects of the unlikely marriage. How long would it last? Would the mountain man prove too wild for domestic life? Would the plains seamstress discover that her husband's reputation held more truth than she had imagined? But beneath the crude humor lay darker speculation. Some men wondered aloud whether Silas McGraw's isolation had affected his judgment in ways that might prove dangerous. Others suggested that a woman desperate enough to marry such a man might have secrets of her own that bore investigation. Most disturbing of all was the attention the marriage had begun attracting from outside Cedar Ridge itself. travelers passing. Through seemed unusually interested in details about the couple, asking questions that went beyond normal curiosity. A stranger had inquired at Henderson's store about Mildred's background and family history. Another had shown particular interest in the location of Silas's mountain retreat. These incidents might have been dismissed as mere gossip-seeking, but Mildred's training had taught her to recognize patterns that others missed. Something about the nature of these inquiries suggested purpose beyond entertainment. Someone somewhere had reasons for wanting information about either her or her future husband, reasons that probably had nothing to do with their wedding. She mentioned her concerns to Silas during one of his visits, watching his expression. Aimed carefully as she described the unusual questions. "You're right to be cautious," he said, after considering her words. "I've noticed riders in the high country who don't belong there. Men who know how to cover their tracks but not well enough to fool someone who's lived in those mountains for 15 years. Do you think it's connected to our marriage? Could be, or could be something else entirely. These mountains have always attracted people with reasons to avoid civilization. Most of them mind their own business, but some—" He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to the knife at his belt. "Some bring trouble wherever they go." The conversation revealed another layer to their relationship. Both had learned to read danger signs that escaped normal observation. Both understood that survival often depended on preparation for threats that might never materialize. This shared awareness created a bond deeper than romantic attraction, the recognition of kindred spirits who had learned to navigate a world more dangerous than it appeared. "After we're married," Silas continued, "you'll need to understand the realities of mountain life. It's not just the isolation or the harsh weather. There are men up there who've put themselves beyond law and conscience. Usually they leave me alone because I'm more trouble than benefit, but a woman," he met her eyes directly, "changes that calculation. You're concerned that marriage will make you a target. I'm concerned that it will make you one." His honesty impressed her even as it sobered her understanding of what lay ahead. Most men would have minimized such dangers to avoid frightening their intended bride. Silas treated her as someone capable of handling difficult truths, another indication that he saw her more clearly than others had managed. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "it would help to know that I'm not entirely helpless. My education included practical skills that go beyond healing." He studied her face with the same intensity she had learned to apply to reading people's true natures. Whatever he saw, there seemed to satisfy him. "I wondered about that too. There's something in the way you carry yourself, the way you watch people when you think they're not looking. Someone taught you to see trouble coming. My mother believed that knowledge was the best protection a woman could possess. She made sure I learned things that most ladies never encounter." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people, discovering that their partnership might be more equal than either had initially imagined. Outside, Cedar Ridge continued its speculation about their improbable union, but inside Mildred's small shop, bride and groom began building the foundation of trust that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding was now less than a week away. Invitations had been extended to the entire town, not from any desire for their presence, but from recognition that excluding them would only fuel more gossip. Most had accepted with the eagerness of spectators anticipating entertainment rather than guests celebrating a sacred ceremony. Reverend Clearwater had expressed some private reservations about the hasty timeline, but his concerns stemmed more from propriety than genuine worry about the couple's compatibility. In his conversations with both bride and groom, he had detected a mutual respect and understanding that many long-time marriages lacked. "I've performed ceremonies for couples who had known each other since childhood," he confided to his wife, "and felt less confident about their chances than I do about these two. There's something solid between them, something that goes deeper than romantic infatuation." As the week progressed, both Silas and Mildred found themselves making practical preparations that revealed their shared understanding of what their marriage would require. He brought supplies to help her close her shop and arrange her possessions for transport to the mountains. She gathered medical supplies and practical books that would serve them both in their isolated life. Neither approached these tasks with the excitement typical of newlyweds, but both demonstrated the careful attention of people who understood that successful partnerships required more than good intentions. They were building something together, not just a marriage, but a fortress against a world that had shown little kindness to either of them alone. The final days before the wedding would test their resolve in ways neither had anticipated, but the foundation they had established in these early conversations would prove strong enough to support whatever challenges awaited them in the mountains and beyond. The week before the wedding brought unseasonable warmth to Cedar Ridge, as if nature itself had decided to bless the unlikely union with perfect weather. Morning frost gave way to afternoons warm enough for shirt sleeves, and the mountain peaks stood clear against skies so blue they seemed painted by an optimistic artist. This meteorological kindness did nothing to soften the town's collective skepticism about Saturday's ceremony. If anything, the approaching wedding date had intensified rather than diminished the community's fascination with what they viewed as an inevitable spectacle. The betting pool had expanded beyond Murphy's saloon to include virtually every establishment in town. Henderson's general store offered odds on whether the bride would actually appear at the church. The barbershop took wagers on how long the ceremony itself would last before someone, bride, groom, or horrified preacher, called a halt to the proceedings. Even the normally dignified Judge Hartwell found himself drawn into speculation, though his concerns ran deeper than mere entertainment. As the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to legal authority, he felt obligated to ensure that neither party was being coerced into an arrangement they might later regret. His wife, Margaret, had volunteered to serve as unofficial investigator, a role that suited her natural inclinations towards social interference. "Someone should speak to that poor girl one more time," Margaret declared over breakfast on Tuesday morning. "Surely she can be made to see reason before it's too late." Judge Hartwell lowered his newspaper with the long-suffering expression of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully. "My dear, Miss Harper is a grown woman of sound mind. If she wishes to marry Silas McGraw, that's her legal right, regardless of what we think of her choice." Legal right, perhaps, but what about common sense? The man is practically a savage who has never broken the law, never caused trouble in town, and has shown nothing but respect for Miss Harper during their brief courtship. Perhaps our judgment says more about us than about him. This conversation, or variations of it, played out in homes throughout Cedar Ridge as the wedding day approached. The divide between those who viewed the marriage as entertainment and those who sensed something deeper at work gradually became apparent. Older residents who had survived frontier hardships that tested character more thoroughly than social conventions tended toward tolerance. Younger townspeople, more concerned with appearances and social standing, maintained their cruel amusement. Mildred observed these dynamics with the detached interest of someone studying a scientific phenomenon. Her hand-sewn wedding dress hung from a peg in her bedroom, its deep blue fabric catching morning light like still water. The garment represented more than mere clothing. It was armor crafted for battle against prejudice, a statement of dignity in the face of mockery. Every stitch had been placed with deliberate care, every seam finished with invisible precision. The dress would photograph well for the formal portrait that documented frontier weddings, but more importantly, it would serve her during the harsh mountain winters that awaited. Practical beauty, her mother would have called it, the kind of elegance that enhanced life rather than merely decorating it. The final fitting took place on Wednesday evening, with Mildred standing before her small mirror while adjusting the bodice and checking the hem length. The woman reflected back at her bore little resemblance to the stereotypical frontier bride. No elaborate lace, no fashionable bustle, no attempt to transform plain features into conventional beauty. Instead, she saw someone who had chosen dignity over decoration, substance over show. "You look beautiful," the voice from her doorway startled her until she realized Silas had arrived for their final pre-wedding meeting. Custom dictated that bride and groom should not see each other for several days before the ceremony, but neither Mildred nor Silas placed much value on customs that served no practical purpose. "Beautiful seems a generous assessment," she replied, though his words pleased her more than she cared to admit. "Not generous. Accurate." He stepped into the room with the careful movements of someone conscious of invading private space. "That dress suits you better than any fancy creation from San Francisco could. It's honest." The word honest struck her as perfectly chosen. Her wedding dress made no false promises, attempted no deception, claimed no beauty beyond what she possessed. Naturally, like the marriage itself, it represented authenticity rather than performance. "Are you ready for Saturday?" she asked, studying his reflection beside hers in the mirror, as ready as a man can be for something he's never done before. He paused, his expression growing serious. "Are you having doubts?" The question deserved honest consideration. In 3 days, she would abandon the life she had known for 28 years, leave the only home she remembered, and trust her future to a man whose reputation inspired fear in hardened frontiersmen. By any rational measure, she should be terrified. "No," she said with certainty that surprised them both. "No doubts about marrying you. Some concerns about what we might face afterward, but no doubts about our decision." "What kind of concerns?" She turned from the mirror to face him directly. "The questions strangers have been asking. The riders you've seen in the mountains, the feeling that our marriage has attracted attention from people whose interest goes beyond normal curiosity." Silas nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that too. Whatever's coming, it's better that we face it together than apart. 2 people who understand each other can accomplish more than either could alone, even if one of them is just a plain seamstress." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Especially then. You see things others miss. Think about problems from angles they never consider. That's worth more than any conventional advantages." Thursday brought the first real test of their partnership when Margaret Hartwell arrived at Mildred's shop, accompanied by 3 other women, determined to stage a final intervention. The delegation included Ruth Henderson, Sarah Whitmore, and surprisingly Adelaide Morrison from the boarding house, a woman whose own romantic history hardly qualified her to offer advice about marital choices. "Mildred, dear," Margaret began, "without preamble, we simply cannot stand by and watch you make such a devastating mistake without one last attempt to bring you to your senses." "Devastating for whom?" Mildred replied calmly, her hands continuing their work on a final alteration. To her wedding dress, Ruth Henderson stepped forward with the fervor of someone delivering crucial intelligence. "We've been asking questions about your intended husband, and what we've discovered should terrify any sensible woman. Such as, he's been living alone in those mountains for 15 years, Sarah Whitmore announced dramatically. 15 years without proper human company. Do you have any idea what that kind of isolation does to a man's mind?" Adelaide Morrison nodded sagely. "I've seen travelers who spent too much time alone. They become unpredictable, sometimes violent. They forget how to behave around civilized people." Mildred set down her needle and regarded the 4 women with patient attention. "Have any of you actually spoken with Mr. McGraw about his life in the mountains?" The question produced uncomfortable silence. "Have you asked him why he chose isolation, or what he's accomplished during those years, or how he's managed to survive? In conditions that would destroy most men?" More silence. "Then perhaps," Mildred continued gently, "your concerns are based on assumptions rather than knowledge." Margaret Hartwell drew herself up with wounded dignity. "We're trying to protect you from making a terrible mistake. I appreciate your intentions, but I'm quite capable of making my own decisions. Mr. McGraw has shown me nothing but courtesy and respect. If that changes after we're married, I'm prepared to deal with whatever challenges arise." The women exchanged glances that clearly communicated their opinion of such naive confidence. "What if he becomes violent?" Ruth Henderson demanded. "What if the isolation has affected his mind more than you realize? What if you're wrong about him?" Mildred interrupted quietly. "What if your fears say more about your prejudices than about his character?" Before the conversation could continue, the shop door opened to admit Silas himself, his timing suggesting he had been listening from outside. The four women stepped back instinctively, their theoretical concerns about his dangerous nature becoming uncomfortably concrete in his physical presence. "Ladies," he said with polite neutrality that somehow managed to fill the small space with intention. Margaret Hartwell recovered her composure first. "Mr. McGraw, we were just expressing our concerns about this hasty marriage. Surely you can understand our worry for Mildred's welfare. I understand that she's lived in this town for 28 years without requiring your protection," Silas replied evenly. "I also understand that she's intelligent enough to make decisions about her own future. But the isolation," Sarah Whitmore began, "will be shared," Silas finished. "Neither of us will be alone anymore." The simple statement carried implications that silenced their protests more effectively than any argument could have. These women, for all their social concern, had never considered that the marriage might benefit both parties rather than representing one person's desperate compromise. After they left, still murmuring disapproval but clearly defeated, Mildred and Silas stood together in the sudden quiet of her shop. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "I was hoping they'd given up trying to change your mind." "They mean well," Mildred replied, though her tone suggested limited patience with good intentions poorly applied. "They simply cannot imagine that anyone might choose differently than they would. And you? Can you imagine choosing differently?" She looked around her small shop, the neat rows of thread, the carefully organized fabrics, the tools of a trade that had sustained her, but never fulfilled her. In 2 days, she would leave all of this behind for an unknown life, with a man who saw possibilities in her that no one else had bothered to discover. "No," she said with quiet conviction, "I cannot imagine choosing differently." Friday arrived, with the kind of clear morning that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Mildred spent the day putting her affairs in order, closing accounts, arranging for her shop's contents to be sold or stored, saying goodbye to the few people whose opinions mattered to her. The most difficult farewell came at the small cemetery where her parents rested beneath simple wooden markers. She knelt beside her mother's grave, her hand pressed against the warm earth, and spoke aloud the thoughts she had carried silently for weeks. "I know this seems sudden, Mama, but I think you'd approve of him. He sees me the way you did, not as someone lacking compared to others, but as someone with her own kind of strength. I wish you could meet him, could tell me if I'm making the right choice." A gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers she had planted on the grave, and Mildred chose to interpret this as her mother's blessing. Saturday's wedding day dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. As Mildred prepared herself in the small room behind her shop, she felt the peculiar calm that comes from having made an irrevocable decision. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it as Mrs. Silas McGraw, partner to a man who had chosen her, not despite her plainness, but because of the strength he recognized beneath it. The wedding dress fit perfectly, its deep blue fabric complementing her complexion and lending dignity to her slight figure. She pinned her mother's locket at her throat, arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style, and prepared to walk to the church, where the entire town waited to witness what they expected to be either tragedy or comedy. The church bells of Cedar Ridge had never rung for a wedding that drew such a crowd. By 11 o'clock, an hour before the ceremony, every pew was occupied and people stood 3 deep along the walls. Word had spread to neighboring settlements, drawing curious onlookers. From ranches and mining camps 50 miles away, the atmosphere resembled a county fair more than a sacred ceremony, with vendors selling refreshments outside and children darting between horses tied to every available post. Inside the modest church, Reverend Clearwater adjusted his collar nervously as he surveyed the packed congregation. In 10 years of frontier ministry, he had never conducted a wedding that generated such intense public interest. The crowd's mood seemed split between anticipation of entertainment and genuine curiosity about whether the unlikely couple would actually go through with their vows. Judge Hartwell and his wife occupied the front pew on the bride's side, their expressions suggesting attendance at a funeral rather than a celebration. Behind them, Ruth Henderson whispered constant commentary to anyone within earshot, while her husband tried, unsuccessfully, to silence her observations about the spectacle they were about to witness. On the groom's side, the seating remained notably sparse. Silas McGraw had few friends in town and no family that anyone knew of. The empty pews on his side of the church provided stark visual evidence of his isolation from the community that had gathered to judge his choice of bride. At precisely noon, the church door opened to admit the groom. Silas McGraw had transformed himself for his wedding day in ways that shocked those who thought they knew him. Gone was the wild mountain man appearance that had intimidated townspeople for years. Instead, a carefully groomed gentleman walked down the aisle, wearing a dark suit that fit his large frame with surprising elegance. His beard, though still full, had been trimmed and shaped. His hair, usually hidden beneath a worn hat, showed silver threads that added dignity rather than age. Most striking of all was his bearing. The man who usually moved through town like a force of nature, trying to avoid notice, now carried himself with quiet confidence, acknowledging the staring crowd with polite nods while making his way to the altar. He had not attempted to disguise his size or his strength, but he had revealed the gentleman that existed beneath his rough exterior. A murmur rippled through the congregation as people reassessed their assumptions about the mountain man they thought they knew. This was not the savage they had expected, but someone who clearly understood the significance of the occasion and had prepared himself accordingly. Reverend Clearwater greeted Silas with genuine warmth, their brief conversation revealing a mutual respect that surprised observers who assumed the preacher shared their concerns about the marriage. Whatever private discussions the two men had held during the preceding weeks had apparently satisfied the minister's doubts about performing the ceremony. Then the church door opened again, and Mildred Harper appeared. The collective intake of breath was audible throughout the building. Not because she had transformed into a conventional beauty, her features remained as plain as ever, but because she had achieved something far more impressive. She had created dignity where none was expected, grace where observers had assumed awkwardness would prevail. Her wedding dress, hand-sewn with invisible perfection, moved with her as if it had grown rather than been crafted. The deep blue fabric complemented her complexion in ways that made her skin seem luminous rather than pale. Her hair, usually pulled back severely, had been arranged to soften her face while maintaining the practical simplicity that suited her nature. But most remarkable was her expression. No nervousness, no uncertainty, no hint of the desperation that observers had assumed must drive such an unlikely match. Instead, she walked down the aisle with the serene confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. The transformation was not physical but spiritual, and it left the wedding guests struggling to reconcile this composed bride with the plain seamstress they had dismissed for years. Some began to wonder if they had misjudged more than just her appearance. As Mildred reached the altar, Silas offered his arm with gentle courtesy, and she accepted with a smile that transformed her face entirely. Standing together before Reverend Clearwater, they created an image that defied every expectation the crowd had brought to the ceremony. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Silas McGraw and Mildred Harper in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, advisedly, and in the fear of God. The familiar words seemed to settle over the congregation like a benediction, reminding them that they were witnessing something sacred rather than merely entertaining. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves drawn into the solemnity of the moment. If any person has just cause why these two should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed stretched longer than usual, as if some members of the congregation were actually considering speaking their objections aloud. But whatever doubts they harbored, none proved strong enough to interrupt the ceremony. The vows themselves departed from traditional wording in ways that revealed the couple's understanding of what they were undertaking together. Rather than promising conventional romantic devotion, they pledged partnership, mutual support, and the kind of practical commitment that frontier life demanded. I, Silas, take thee, Mildred, to be my lawful wedded wife, the groom said, in a voice that carried to the back of the church, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. But then he added words that were clearly his own. I promise to see you as you truly are, to value your strength and your wisdom, and to build with you a life worthy of the trust you place in me. When Mildred spoke her vows, her voice remained soft but carried perfect clarity. I, Mildred, take thee, Silas, to be my lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Her addition proved equally personal. I promise to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, to bring my best efforts to our partnership, and to trust in the strength we can build together. The exchange of simple gold bands completed the ceremony, and when Reverend Clearwater pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was brief but genuine, a seal on their commitment rather than a performance for the watching crowd. As the newly married couple turned to face the congregation, something remarkable happened. The crowd that had gathered expecting entertainment found themselves offering genuine applause, whether moved by the dignity of the ceremony or impressed by the transformation they had witnessed. The people of Cedar Ridge responded with respect rather than mockery. The receiving line that formed outside the church provided the first real test of the community's changed attitude. One by one, neighbors who had spent weeks speculating about the marriage offered congratulations that seemed increasingly sincere. As the afternoon progressed, Judge Hartwell, his wife Margaret beside him, extended his hand to Silas with formal courtesy. Mr. McGraw, Mrs. McGraw, may your marriage bring you both happiness and prosperity. Margaret's congratulations proved more grudging, but even she seemed affected by what she had witnessed. You both conducted yourselves with great dignity today, she admitted. I wish you well. Dr. Whitmore, steadier than usual for a Saturday afternoon, offered professional blessing. If you need medical attention in the mountains, don't hesitate to send word. Distance shouldn't prevent proper care. Even Ruth Henderson, the town's most persistent gossip, managed gracious words. Your dress was beautiful, dear. You looked lovely today. But beneath these surface courtesies, Mildred detected undercurrents that suggested the day's revelations had raised new questions rather than settling old ones. She caught fragments of whispered conversations that revealed growing curiosity about both her background and Silas's true nature. Where did she learn to carry herself like that? Did you see how he looked at her? Like she was precious. Makes you wonder what we don't know about either of them. These speculations might have concerned a couple with secrets to hide, but Mildred found them almost amusing. Let the town wonder. Soon enough, she and Silas would be beyond reach of their curiosity, building a life that owed nothing to others' approval or understanding. The wedding feast, hosted by the church ladies as was customary, provided further opportunities for observation and assessment. Mildred watched her new husband navigate social interactions with the same careful attention she had learned to apply to reading people's true natures. Silas handled the congratulations and conversation with surprising grace, revealing social skills that his isolated lifestyle had hidden from public view. He spoke intelligently about various topics, listened attentively to others' comments, and maintained the kind of quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding attention. More importantly, she observed how he included her in every conversation, treating her as an equal partner rather than a silent appendage. When men directed questions solely to him, he made sure to seek her opinion. When women spoke only to her about domestic matters, he demonstrated genuine interest in her responses. This behavior impressed the wedding guests more than any romantic gesture could have. In a time and place where wives often became invisible extensions of their husbands, Silas McGraw's treatment of his bride suggested a partnership that defied conventional expectations. As the afternoon wore on, Mildred found herself studying not just her husband, but the community that had gathered to witness their union. These people, who had known her for 28 years, were seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The recognition in their eyes was gratifying, but it also carried a touch of sadness. How many others, she wondered, lived among neighbors who never bothered to look beyond surface appearances? How many valuable people remained hidden because no one cared enough to search for their true worth? The reflection was interrupted by a disturbing observation. Among the wedding guests, she noticed several faces that didn't belong to Cedar Ridge. Residents, strangers who had somehow learned about the ceremony and traveled considerable distances to attend. Their presence might have been explained by simple curiosity, but something in their manner suggested more focused interest. One man in particular drew her attention. Well-dressed and obviously educated, he stood apart from the other guests while maintaining careful observation of both bride and groom. When their eyes met briefly, he offered a polite nod that somehow seemed more acknowledgement than greeting. She mentioned her observation to Silas during a quiet moment between conversations. "I see him," her husband replied, without looking in the stranger's direction. "There are two others I don't recognize either. Professional watchers, I'd guess, though I can't say what they're watching for. Should we be concerned? Cautious, perhaps. But not today. Today is for celebrating what we've begun together." His words reminded her that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them as partners. The plain seamstress and the mountain man had created something together that was stronger than either could have achieved alone. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across Cedar Ridge, it was time for the newly married couple to begin their journey to their mountain home. The crowd gathered to see them off, their earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching genuine goodwill. Silas had brought a sturdy wagon to transport Mildred's possessions, along with the medical supplies and practical books she had chosen to take to their new life. The sight of these carefully selected items, evidence of serious preparation rather than romantic impulse, provided final confirmation that this marriage was based on thoughtful planning rather than desperate compromise. As they prepared to leave, Mildred took one last look at the town that had been her home for nearly 3 decades. She felt no regret at leaving, only anticipation for what lay ahead. Among the mountain peaks that had always seemed forbidding from a distance, she would discover whether the partnership she and Silas had begun could flourish into something that justified the risks they had both taken. The wagon rolled away from Cedar Ridge as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, carrying Mr. and Mrs. Silas McGraw toward a future that neither the departing couple nor the watching townspeople could have imagined. The journey into the mountains began as evening settled over the high country, transforming familiar landscapes into something mysterious and beautiful. Mildred had never traveled beyond Cedar Ridge's immediate vicinity, and the gradual ascent into Silas's domain revealed a world she had only imagined from her shop window. The wagon road, little more than twin ruts carved by necessity rather than engineering, wound steadily upward through stands of pine and aspen that seemed to whisper secrets in the mountain wind. Stream beds, swollen with spring snowmelt, chattered alongside the trail, their voices creating a natural symphony that city-raised ears might find unsettling, but which spoke to Mildred of peace and possibility. Silas drove with the easy competence of someone who could navigate these paths in complete darkness, his attention divided between the terrain ahead and the woman beside him. The transformation from public ceremony to private beginning seemed to have relaxed him, revealing glimpses of personality that formal courtship had kept hidden. "It's beautiful," Mildred said, as they crested a ridge that offered views of peaks stretching endlessly toward the western horizon. "Different from town life," Silas replied. "Some find it lonely after a while. Too much space, too much silence. And others discover that space and silence provide room for thoughts that never had a chance to develop in crowded places." The comment revealed something about his 15 years of chosen isolation that mere facts could not convey. This was not a man who had fled to the mountains to escape responsibility or civilization's demands, but someone who had found in solitude the conditions necessary for becoming his truest self. As darkness settled over the high country, they made camp beside a stream that reflected starlight like scattered diamonds. Silas had packed supplies for the journey with the same careful attention he brought to all practical matters, including a small tent that would provide adequate shelter for the night. The intimacy of sharing confined space might have proved awkward for newlyweds who barely knew each other, but both Mildred and Silas seemed to understand that their marriage was founded on partnership rather than passion. They arranged their sleeping arrangements with the practical courtesy of experienced travelers, focusing on comfort and propriety rather than romantic expectations. Yet as they sat beside their small campfire, sharing a simple meal and listening to the mountain night sounds, something deeper began developing between them. The formal politeness of courtship gradually gave way to genuine conversation as each discovered aspects of the other's character that public meetings had never revealed. "Tell me about the books you've read," Silas said, as they watched sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. The request surprised Mildred, who had grown accustomed to people assuming her interests extended no further than needlework and gossip. "What would you like to know? What taught you to see people the way you do? You read character better than anyone I've met, and that kind of insight usually comes from study as well as experience." She considered how much to reveal about her unconventional education. "My mother believed that understanding human nature was essential for survival, especially for women who might not have other protections. She made sure I learned to observe carefully and think analytically about what I observed. Formal training? Some. We had visitors who taught me things that most young ladies never encounter. Medical knowledge, practical psychology, skills that—" She paused, still uncertain how much her new husband needed to know about her past. "Skills that proved useful in ways my mother probably never intended." Silas studied her face in the firelight with the same careful attention she had learned to apply to reading others. "You're talking about more than healing and needlework." It was not a question, but a statement that invited confirmation or denial. Mildred found herself at a crossroads that would define the honesty level of their marriage from its beginning. "Yes," she said simply. "Much more." Rather than pressing for details she seemed reluctant to provide, Silas nodded and changed the subject to his own background. "I wasn't always a mountain hermit. Before I came here, I lived in places where reading people quickly could mean the difference between living and dying." "What kind of places?" Army posts on the frontier, trading posts in hostile territory, towns where law came from whoever was fastest with a gun rather than whoever had the most legal knowledge. The revelation explained much about his bearing and his ability to assess threats that others missed. It also suggested experiences that would have left marks on any man's soul. What brought you to these mountains? Weariness, mostly. Too many years of watching civilization spread itself thin over territories it didn't understand. Too many good. Men dead because politicians made decisions based on maps instead of reality. He stirred the fire with a stick, sending new sparks spiraling upward. I came here to find peace and discovered that solitude suited me better than society. Until now. He met her eyes across the small fire, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken despite their practical arrangement. Until now. Some kinds of loneliness can't be cured by solitude, and some partnerships make both people stronger than either could be alone. They talked until the fire burned low, sharing carefully chosen pieces of their histories while avoiding details that might prove too revealing too quickly. Yet even these limited exchanges created bonds deeper than many marriages achieved after years of shared living. When they finally retired to their small tent, both understood that their wedding night would not follow conventional patterns. They were building something together, but it would develop at its own pace, according to its own logic, rather than society's expectations about marital intimacy. Morning brought crisp mountain air and views that stretched beyond any horizon Mildred had ever imagined. As they broke camp and continued their ascent, she began to understand why Silas had chosen this harsh but beautiful country as his refuge from a world that demanded more than it offered. The final approach to his cabin led through a narrow valley, hidden between towering peaks, accessible only to those who knew the correct combination of trails and passages. The location provided natural defense while offering resources essential for survival: fresh water, adequate timber, sheltered grazing for livestock, and game trails that ensured meat for those skilled enough to hunt successfully. The cabin itself exceeded every expectation Mildred had formed during their conversations in town. Rather than the crude shelter she had imagined, Silas had constructed a substantial home that demonstrated both practical skill and aesthetic sensibility. Built from logs expertly fitted and chinked, the structure stood 2 stories high with a wide front porch that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Windows, real glass rather than oiled paper, had been positioned to capture maximum daylight while providing strategic observation points for anyone concerned about unwelcome visitors. Inside, the cabin revealed even more impressive craftsmanship. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace capable of heating the entire structure, while a well-equipped kitchen occupied one corner with provisions for serious cooking rather than mere survival. Furniture, obviously handmade but demonstrating considerable skill, provided comfort without sacrificing durability. Most surprising of all was the extensive library that occupied built-in shelves along one wall. Hundreds of volumes, carefully protected from moisture and insects, covered subjects ranging from practical skills to philosophy, history to literature. This collection represented years of careful acquisition and spoke to intellectual hunger. That isolation had never satisfied. "How did you manage all this?" Mildred asked as she explored her new home. 15 years of steady work," Silas replied with obvious pride in his accomplishment. Trading furs provided money for materials, and winter months gave time for construction. A man can achieve considerable progress when he has clear goals and no distractions. The tour continued upstairs, where Silas had prepared a bedroom for his new wife that demonstrated both consideration and tact. Her own space, furnished with pieces he had crafted himself, offered privacy and comfort, without presuming intimacy before it developed naturally. Yet, as impressive as the cabin was, Mildred found herself most intrigued by a small, locked room that Silas mentioned only briefly during their tour. "My office," he explained when she asked about it. where I keep records and correspondence. Nothing that would interest you." His tone suggested the subject was closed, but Mildred's trained. I caught subtle signs that contradicted his casual dismissal. The lock was more sophisticated than necessary for simple record-keeping. The door frame showed reinforcement that seemed excessive for protecting account books. And most telling of all, she glimpsed through the keyhole what appeared to be maps and documents that suggested activities more complex than fur trading. She said nothing about her observations, but filed them away for future consideration. Her new husband clearly maintained secrets that went beyond his acknowledged desire for privacy, and those secrets might eventually require attention from someone with her particular skills. For now, however, she focused on settling into her new life and discovering what domestic partnership with Silas McGraw would actually entail. The first few days revealed a man who had adapted successfully to solitary living while retaining social graces that made shared living surprisingly comfortable. He cooked competently, having learned from necessity rather than choice. He maintained the cabin and its surroundings with systematic attention that prevented small problems from becoming major ones. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions about improvements or changes that would make their home more suitable for two people rather than one. The kitchen could use better organization for serious cooking, Mildred observed, after studying the current arrangement. "Show me what you'd change," Silas replied immediately. "I've been batching it for 15 years, so I'm probably doing everything the hard way." His willingness to defer to her expertise in areas where she clearly knew more impressed her, even as it revealed the kind of practical partnership she had hoped their marriage might become. This was not a man who would demand submission simply because custom granted him authority, but someone who valued competence regardless of its source. The transformation of their cabin's domestic arrangements provided the first real test of their ability to work together toward common goals. Within a week, they had reorganized the kitchen, improved storage throughout the house, and established routines that accommodated both their individual preferences and their shared needs. More significantly, they began developing the kind of easy communication that successful partnerships require. Silas learned to read Mildred's subtle signals about her preferences and concerns. She discovered that his gruff exterior concealed someone who appreciated thoughtful conversation and gentle humor when circumstances permitted. Yet, even as their domestic life settled into comfortable patterns, both remained aware of external factors that might disturb their mountain refuge. The strangers who had attended their wedding represented questions that had followed them from Cedar Ridge. The locked room upstairs contained secrets that might eventually demand acknowledgement, and the isolation that provided peace also created vulnerabilities that would require careful management. Hidden in Mildred's carefully organized possessions was a journal that had traveled with her from town, its pages filled with observations about people and events that revealed analytical skills far beyond those of a simple seamstress. Each evening, as Silas tended to his own mysterious correspondence in the locked room, she added new entries that documented her growing understanding of their situation and the forces that might threaten their carefully constructed peace. Both husband and wife sensed that their honeymoon period in the mountain cabin would not last indefinitely. The world they had left behind would eventually follow them into their refuge, bringing challenges that would test whether their partnership was strong enough to survive pressures that had destroyed more conventional marriages. But for now, in the quiet evenings beside their fireplace, with mountain winds singing through the pines outside, they built the foundation of trust and understanding that would sustain them when those challenges finally arrived. 3 weeks into their mountain marriage, Mildred made a discovery that would forever change her understanding of both her husband and herself. The morning had begun like many others, with Silas departing before dawn to check his trap lines, and Mildred settling into the domestic routines that had become surprisingly satisfying. She had never imagined that managing a mountain household could provide the kind of intellectual challenge that kept her mind engaged. But the complexities of high-altitude living demanded constant adaptation and problem-solving. She was reorganizing the root cellar when she noticed something odd about the cabin's construction. The space seemed smaller than the exterior dimensions suggested, as if several feet of potential storage had been lost to some architectural necessity she couldn't identify. Curiosity, always one of her defining characteristics, prompted closer investigation. What she discovered was a concealed door so expertly hidden that only someone with her trained eye for detail would have noticed the subtle variations in wood grain that marked its edges. The door was locked, but Mildred's unconventional education had included skills that most ladies never acquired. Within minutes, the mechanism yielded to her careful manipulation, revealing a hidden chamber that took her breath away. The concealed room contained enough weapons to outfit a small army. Rifles, pistols, knives, and ammunition were arranged with military precision along specially constructed racks. Maps covered one wall, marked with notations in multiple hands and languages. A sophisticated telegraph key occupied a corner desk beside stacks of coded messages and official-looking documents. But most shocking of all was what she found in a locked chest at the room's center, a tarnished marshal's badge and commission, papers that identified her husband as Deputy U.S. Marshal Silas McGraw, assigned to covert operations in the Montana Territory. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. The man she had married was not simply a reclusive mountain dweller, but an active federal law enforcement officer conducting operations so secret that even his own wife had been kept ignorant of his true identity. As she studied the documents, with growing amazement, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed began falling into place. The strangers who had attended their wedding, the mysterious visitors Silas sometimes mentioned without explanation, the locked office upstairs, and his careful evasions about his correspondence. All of it made sense now in ways that both impressed and terrified her. But as she prepared to confront her husband with her discovery, another shock awaited her. Hidden beneath the marshal's commission was a file bearing her own name, and what she read there made her legs weak with astonishment. The federal government had been tracking her movements for more than 5 years. According to the meticulously detailed reports, Mildred Harper was not the simple seamstress she appeared to be, but someone whose true identity and activities had drawn official attention at the highest levels. The file documented her real background with accuracy that suggested surveillance far more sophisticated than she had ever detected. Her mother, Eleanor Harper, had indeed been beautiful, but beauty was the least significant of her qualifications. Eleanor had been one of the first female federal agents operating under deep cover throughout the Western Territories during the 1820s and 1830s. Her supposed death from consumption had been an elaborate fiction designed to allow her to disappear. When her cover was finally compromised, Mildred herself had been trained from childhood to continue her mother's work, though she had believed her education served purely practical purposes. The medical knowledge, the analytical skills, the ability to read character and situation, all of it had been preparation for a role she had never consciously accepted, but had been fulfilling nonetheless. For 5 years, her reports to supposed medical colleagues had actually been intelligence communications to federal authorities. Her observations about suspicious characters passing through Cedar Ridge had helped break up smuggling operations and track fugitive criminals. Her careful documentation of local economic conditions had informed government policy about territorial development. She had been a federal agent without knowing it. Her cover so deep that even she had believed it completely. The file contained one more revelation that left her shaking. Her marriage to Silas McGraw had been arranged by federal authorities who believed their combined skills would prove valuable. In addressing a growing threat to territorial security, The Crimson Creek Gang, led by a man called Black Jack Morrison, had established operations in the high country that threatened to destabilize the entire region. Traditional law enforcement had proven inadequate against their sophisticated organization and intimate knowledge of mountain terrain. The marriage of two experienced but unacknowledged federal operatives had been designed to create a covert team capable of infiltrating and dismantling the criminal organization. As Mildred sat in the hidden weapons room, surrounded by evidence of deceptions that went far deeper than anything she had imagined, she heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Silas was returning earlier than expected, and she had only moments to decide how to handle revelations that changed everything about their relationship. She quickly secured the documents and closed the concealed room, but left the lock undone, in a way that would signal to her husband that his secret had been discovered. Then she returned to her domestic tasks and waited for whatever confrontation was about to occur. Silas entered the cabin with the quiet alertness that had characterized his movements since their wedding day, but she saw him freeze when he noticed subtle signs that his concealed room had been accessed. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt before conscious thought reasserted control. "Mildred!" he called, his voice carefully neutral. "In the kitchen?" she replied, continuing to knead bread dough with steady hands while her mind raced through possible conversations. He found her working at the kitchen table, her movements calm and purposeful despite the revolutionary knowledge she had just acquired. For a long moment, they studied each other with the wariness of poker players who suspect their opponents hold better cards than initially apparent. "I see you've been exploring the cabin more thoroughly," Silas said carefully. "I have, and you've been rather less than completely honest about your activities here. As have you, I suspect." The admission hung between them like smoke from a gun neither had intended to fire. Both realized that their carefully constructed marriage had just revealed itself to be something far more complex than either had acknowledged. "How long have you known?" Mildred asked, setting aside her bread dough and facing him directly. "About your real background, since before I proposed. About your intelligence work. I suspected, but wasn't certain until I read your reports. My reports. The ones you've been sending to Dr. Matthews in Denver. Except there is no Dr. Matthews, just a postal box monitored by federal authorities who've been analyzing your observations about territorial conditions for the past 5 years. The revelation that her supposed medical correspondence had been intelligence communications struck her with force equal to discovering his marshal's commission. They had both been living lies so complex that they had fooled even themselves. "So, our marriage was arranged by people who believed we'd work well together, yes, but the choice to go through with it was ours. They created the opportunity, but we decided whether to take it." Mildred considered this distinction while studying her husband's face for signs of deception or regret. What she saw there was neither, but rather something that looked like relief at finally being able to speak honestly. "The Crimson Creek Gang," she said, testing her understanding of their situation. "You've read the files. Enough to understand why two covert operatives might be useful in addressing the problem." Silas moved closer, his expression growing serious. "It's worse than the reports indicate. Black Jack Morrison isn't just running a criminal organization. He's building a private army with connections to foreign interests who want to destabilize territorial authority. Traditional law enforcement can't handle this level of threat. But a mountain man and his wife might be able to get close enough to gather intelligence, or eliminate key leaders if intelligence gathering proves insufficient." The casual reference to assassination reminded Mildred that her husband's skills extended far beyond hunting and trapping. His 15 years in these mountains had not been spent in peaceful isolation, but in developing capabilities that made him uniquely dangerous to criminal organizations operating in the high country. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you. Our marriage is legal regardless of how it was arranged. We can continue building the life we started, but it will include responsibilities that go beyond domestic partnership. Mildred walked to the window that offered views of the peaks surrounding their hidden valley. Somewhere in those mountains, a criminal organization was preparing operations that threatened everything she had come to value about their new life together. The choice facing her was not whether to help stop them, her training and inclinations made that inevitable, but whether to do so as part of a partnership that had already proven more satisfying than anything she had previously experienced. "I assume you have a plan," she said without turning from the window. "The beginnings of one. But it will require both our skills, and it will be dangerous in ways that domestic life never is." She turned to face him, seeing not the simple mountain man who had courted her in Cedar Ridge, but the experienced federal officer who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. "Show me what you know about Morrison's organization," she said, "and then we'll develop a plan that might actually work." As they returned to the hidden room to study maps and intelligence reports together, both understood that their marriage had just evolved into something unprecedented in their experience. They were no longer simply husband and wife, but partners in an undertaking that would test every skill they possessed and every bond they had built together. The plain seamstress and the mountain man had revealed themselves to be two of the most capable covert operatives in federal service, and their quiet mountain refuge was about to become the headquarters for a campaign that would determine the future of law and order in the Montana Territory. Outside their cabin, the same peaks that had offered peaceful isolation now concealed dangers that would require all their combined expertise to overcome. The honeymoon was over, and the real work of their partnership was about to begin. The transformation of their mountain cabin from peaceful refuge to operational headquarters took place with military efficiency that revealed just how thoroughly both Silas and Mildred had been trained for exactly this kind of work. Within hours of their mutual revelations, maps covered every available surface, coded messages traveled through telegraph networks, and weapons were cleaned and prepared for action that now seemed inevitable rather than merely possible. Silas's father's rifle, a legendary weapon known throughout the territory for its accuracy and the skill of its owner, occupied a place of honor among their arsenal. The Winchester had belonged to 3 generations of McGraw men, each of whom had used it to protect their families and communities from threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. Now it would serve a 4th generation in what promised to be its most challenging test. "Morrison's made a mistake," Silas explained, as they studied intelligence reports spread across their kitchen table. "He's grown overconfident after 2 years of successful operations. His organization has expanded beyond what the mountains can easily hide." Mildred traced supply routes marked on a detailed topographical map, her analytical mind processing information with the same systematic approach she had once applied to managing her seamstress shop's inventory. 70 men minimum, based on these provisioning requirements, probably closer to 100 when you account for lookouts and rotating guards. Too many for a frontal assault, but small enough that disrupting their leadership might fragment the entire organization. She nodded, appreciating the strategic thinking that made their partnership more effective than either could have been alone. The question becomes how to get close enough to those leaders without triggering the kind of defensive response that would turn this into a siege. "About that," Silas said, his expression growing serious, "there's something else you need to know. Morrison's been asking questions about our marriage, specific questions that suggest he knows more about both of us than we'd prefer." The revelation sent a chill through Mildred that had nothing to do with mountain weather. "What kind of questions?" "About your background before Cedar Ridge, about my activities during the past 15 years, about whether our marriage might be something other than what it appears." He met her eyes directly. "I think someone in federal service has been feeding him information." The possibility of betrayal within their own organization added complexity to an already dangerous situation. If Morrison possessed inside knowledge about their true identities and mission, their advantage of surprise had already been compromised. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Not much. My sources indicate he's planning something major within the next 2 weeks. If we're going to act, it has to be soon." They spent the remainder of that day developing a plan that would rely heavily on the skills that had made them valuable to federal authorities in the first place. Mildred's ability to read character and blend into almost any social situation would allow her to infiltrate Morrison's organization at a level where she could gather crucial intelligence. Silas's knowledge of mountain warfare and his reputation as a dangerous but politically unaffiliated mountain man would provide the kind of credible threat that might drive Morrison into tactical mistakes. But their strategy required them to separate temporarily, each playing their role while maintaining communication through methods that would not reveal their coordination to hostile observation. The prospect of dividing their forces troubled both of them, not merely because of tactical concerns, but because they had discovered that their partnership provided emotional strength as well as operational effectiveness. "I don't like leaving you exposed," Silas admitted as they finalized their preparations. "I'm more concerned about you attempting to face Morrison's entire organization alone if something goes wrong with my infiltration." They were discussing logistics when a sound from outside brought both to instant alertness. Horses approached their hidden valley, moving with the careful pace of riders who knew they were entering dangerous territory but felt confident about their reception. Silas moved to a window that offered concealed observation of the trail leading to their cabin. What he saw there confirmed their worst fears about how much Morrison knew of their activities. 3 riders, he reported quietly. Professional men, well armed, moving like they know exactly where they're going. Mildred joined him at the window, studying the approaching horseman with trained eyes. "The one in the center, that's Blackjack Morrison himself. I've seen his photograph in the intelligence files, the criminal leader's presence at their remote." A cabin could mean only one thing. Their cover had been completely compromised, and they now faced immediate rather than future danger. "Can we defend this position?" Mildred asked, mentally cataloging their weapons and ammunition supplies. "For a while, but if he's brought more men than we can see, this could turn into the kind of siege that ends badly for everyone involved." They had perhaps 5 minutes before the riders reached their cabin, 5 minutes to decide whether to fight from their prepared position or attempt some other response that might preserve their mission objectives. "There's another possibility," Mildred said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. "What if we let him think he's caught us unprepared? Give him the overconfidence that might lead to mistakes we can exploit." Silas considered the suggestion with the rapid tactical assessment that had kept him alive through years of dangerous operations. Risky. If we're wrong about his intentions, we lose every advantage we've spent weeks preparing. But if we're right, we might learn more about his organization in the next hour than months of surveillance could provide. The sound of approaching horses grew closer as they made their decision. Whatever happened next would determine not just their personal survival, but the success or failure of their mission to eliminate the most dangerous criminal organization in the Montana Territory. Silas moved quickly to conceal the most obvious evidence of their intelligence activities, while Mildred arranged herself in the kind of domestic scene that would support their cover as simple newlyweds. Yet both remained acutely aware of weapon locations and tactical options that might become necessary if their gamble proved unsuccessful. The knock on their door came with the polite firmness of someone who expected to be welcomed rather than challenged. Morrison's voice, cultured and pleasant, carried clearly through the wooden barrier between them. "Mr. and Mrs. McGraw, I hope we're not intruding. I'm Jack Morrison, and I was hoping we might have a brief conversation about mutual interests." Silas opened the door with the cautious hospitality appropriate to an isolated mountain dweller receiving unexpected visitors. What he saw confirmed that Morrison possessed both the intelligence and confidence that made him dangerous beyond his criminal activities. Blackjack Morrison was not the crude outlaw that frontier justice usually confronted. Instead, he appeared to be a gentleman who might have been equally at home in Denver's best hotels or Washington's political circles. Well-dressed, articulate, and carrying himself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes respected, he presented a far more sophisticated threat than typical criminal leaders. His companions were cut from different cloth, professional gunmen whose presence served notice that politeness had strict limits, and violations would be answered with immediate violence. "Mr. Morrison," Silas replied with careful neutrality, "you're a long way from the usual travel routes." "Indeed I am. But then, so are you and your lovely bride. I find myself curious about what brings two such interesting people to this particular refuge from civilization." The comment carried implications that made clear Morrison knew far more about them than any chance encounter could explain. Yet his manner remained friendly, even charming, as if he were paying a social call rather than conducting what amounted to an interrogation. "We value our privacy," Mildred said from her position beside the fireplace, projecting the kind of nervous courtesy appropriate to a frontier wife entertaining dangerous strangers. "Of course you do. Privacy is a precious commodity these days, especially for people whose previous activities might attract unwelcome attention from various authorities." Morrison stepped into their cabin with the confident movements of someone who felt no immediate threat, his eyes taking in details that would tell him volumes about the occupant's true nature and capabilities. What he saw was precisely what Silas and Mildred wanted him to see: a comfortable but unremarkable mountain home, occupied by a couple whose resources and preparations seemed adequate for ordinary frontier life, but inadequate for serious conflict with professional criminals. Yet something in Morrison's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by the scene they had arranged for his benefit. His attention lingered on subtle details that might reveal more than intended about their actual capabilities and connections. "I understand congratulations are in order," he continued conversationally. "Your recent wedding created quite a stir in Cedar Ridge. Some found it surprising that two such, shall we say, reserved individuals would choose each other for matrimony." "People talk," Silas replied evenly, "especially when they don't have enough real concerns to occupy their time." Morrison smiled with genuine amusement. How true, though in this case the talk proved informative to those who knew how to listen properly. "It seems your courtship and marriage attracted attention from circles well beyond local gossip." The statement represented the most direct acknowledgement yet that their federal connections had been discovered. Morrison was no longer probing. He was announcing his knowledge while studying their reactions to gauge how much additional information he might extract. Mildred felt her heart rate increase despite her training in managing stress responses. If Morrison possessed detailed knowledge of their operational background, this conversation represented far greater danger than a simple criminal confrontation. Yet she also recognized an opportunity. Morrison's willingness to reveal his knowledge suggested overconfidence that might be turned against him if they could maintain their deception long enough to learn about his own plans and capabilities. "I'm afraid you have us at a disadvantage, Mr. Morrison," she said with carefully modulated concern. "We're just trying to build a quiet life together. If our marriage has somehow caused problems for other people, perhaps you could explain what we might do to resolve any misunderstandings." The response was perfectly pitched to suggest innocent confusion rather than tactical awareness, and Morrison's expression showed appreciation for what he clearly recognized as skillful performance. "My dear Mrs. McGraw, there are no misunderstandings. Only questions about how much two such talented individuals might contribute to enterprises that require exactly their particular skills. The offer hung in the air like gun smoke, dangerous and unmistakable in its implications. Morrison was not there to threaten them, but to recruit them, believing their federal connections might be overcome by appeals to greed or dissatisfaction with their current circumstances. It was exactly the kind of opportunity their mission required, but accepting would place them deeper into Morrison's organization than any previous intelligence operation had managed to achieve. The risks were enormous, but so were the potential rewards for understanding and ultimately destroying the criminal network that threatened territorial stability. Silas and Mildred exchanged the kind of subtle glance that married couples use to communicate complex thoughts without words. In that brief moment, they made the decision that would determine the final phase of their mission, and quite possibly their survival. "What kind of enterprise?" Silas asked, his tone suggesting interest rather than suspicion. Morrison's smile broadened. With satisfaction at what he interpreted as successful recruitment of two valuable assets to his organization, the kind that makes full use of exceptional talents while providing rewards commensurate with the risks involved. "I believe you'll find the work both challenging and profitable." As afternoon shadows lengthened across their mountain valley, Silas and Mildred McGraw prepared to enter the most dangerous phase of their careers as federal operatives, posing as recruits to the very organization they had been assigned to destroy. The journey to Morrison's mountain stronghold began at dawn, with Mildred and Silas riding as apparent recruits to the organization they had been assigned to destroy. The irony was not lost on either of them, but successful deep-cover operations required commitment to deception that could mean the difference between gathering crucial intelligence and ending up dead in some remote canyon. Morrison had provided them with a small signal mirror, supposedly for emergency communication, but actually serving as a test of their commitment to his organization. The device would allow them to send coded messages to Confederates positioned throughout the high country, messages that Morrison's people would intercept and analyze for signs of betrayal or federal involvement. What Morrison didn't know was that both Silas and Mildred had been trained in mirror signaling techniques that allowed them to embed secondary messages within apparently innocent communications. Their reports to Morrison's organization would contain exactly the information he expected to receive, while simultaneously transmitting crucial intelligence to federal forces positioned to intercept their real mission data. The criminal stronghold exceeded every estimate federal intelligence had developed about Morrison's operations. Rather than a crude outlaw camp, they discovered a sophisticated military installation that could have challenged regular army units in direct confrontation. Defensive positions had been carved into the mountain rock itself, creating fields of fire that would make assault prohibitively costly. Supply depots contained enough weapons and ammunition to outfit several companies of troops, while communication equipment allowed coordination with criminal networks throughout the Western Territories. Most disturbing of all was the evidence of foreign involvement that federal authorities had suspected but never confirmed. Military advisors whose accents suggested European training supervised defensive preparations, while technical specialists maintained equipment far more advanced than anything available through normal frontier commercial channels. "Welcome to the future of territorial development," Morrison announced as he led them through his installation. When Washington finally realizes that their traditional approach to law enforcement has become obsolete, organizations like ours will provide the stability necessary for real progress. His words revealed political ambitions that went far beyond simple criminal enterprise. Morrison envisioned himself as an alternative to federal authority, offering protection services to mining operations and cattle ranches, while simultaneously eliminating competitors who refused to acknowledge his jurisdiction. Impressive operation, Silas commented with apparent admiration, while mentally cataloguing defensive weaknesses that federal forces might exploit. How many men do you have under arms? Enough to handle any law enforcement response the territory can mount. But quantity means nothing without quality leadership and proper training. That's where people like yourselves become valuable. Morrison's confidence seemed justified by what they observed during their first day in his stronghold. The men under his command demonstrated discipline and tactical awareness that surpassed most territorial militia units. Their weapons were well maintained, their defensive positions professionally constructed, and their communication systems coordinated with precision that suggested genuine military experience among the leadership. Yet, Mildred's trained eye for reading character and motivation detected subtle signs that suggested Morrison's organization might be less stable than it appeared. The foreign advisors maintained careful distance from their American counterparts, suggesting mutual suspicion rather than genuine cooperation. Some of Morrison's lieutenants showed signs of stress that indicated uncertainty about their leaders' increasingly ambitious plans. Most significantly, she noticed that Morrison himself seemed to be under pressure from sources beyond territorial law enforcement. References to timeline pressures and external expectations suggested that his organization answered to authorities whose identity remained carefully concealed, but whose demands were driving expansion beyond what prudent criminal enterprise would attempt. Their second day in the stronghold brought the first real test of their cover identities, when Morrison assigned them to participate in planning for what he described as a demonstration of capability that would convince territorial authorities to negotiate rather than continue futile law enforcement efforts. The target was Cedar Ridge itself. Morrison intended to raid the town where Silas and Mildred had been married, seizing the bank's contents, while demonstrating that no community could consider itself safe from his organization's reach. The psychological impact would be enormous, proving that even a coordinated federal territorial response could not protect frontier settlements from determined criminal assault. Your knowledge of the town's layout and habits will be invaluable, Morrison explained as they studied maps of Cedar Ridge's streets and buildings. Local intelligence can mean the difference between clean success and costly complications. Silas found himself in the impossible position of having to provide tactical advice for an assault on people he had known for years, while Mildred faced the equally difficult challenge of helping plan an operation that would endanger everyone who had attended their wedding just weeks earlier. Yet their federal training had prepared them for exactly this kind of moral complexity. The only way to minimize casualties and protect the community was to ensure they remained integral to Morrison's planning process, where they could introduce subtle modifications that might reduce violence while gathering intelligence about the criminal organization's broader activities. The town's basically defenseless, Silas reported with apparent satisfaction, while actually laying groundwork for recommendations that would protect civilian lives. Judge Hartwell has a pistol, Doctor. Whitmore owns a shotgun he's too drunk to use effectively, and most of the other men have hunting rifles, but no military experience. Excellent. We'll plan for minimal resistance during the actual operation. Mildred added her own observations about the town's routines and vulnerabilities, carefully steering the conversation toward tactical approaches that would limit civilian exposure while appearing to maximize operational efficiency. Market day brings everyone to town, she noted, but it also creates confusion that might provide cover for escape routes if something goes wrong. Or it might create hostage opportunities if negotiation becomes necessary, Morrison replied with casual brutality that reminded both operatives of exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. As planning continued throughout the day, it became clear that Morrison intended the Cedar Ridge raid to serve multiple purposes beyond simple robbery. The operation would test his organization's ability to coordinate complex assaults while demonstrating to potential recruits that federal law enforcement could not protect frontier communities. More ominously, success would prove to his foreign backers that American territorial authority could be challenged directly without triggering the kind of massive federal response that would interfere with their broader political objectives. The raid was scheduled for the following Saturday, Market Day, when the town would be crowded with ranchers and their families conducting weekly business. Morrison's tactical planning assumed that civilian presence would deter organized resistance while providing human shields if federal forces attempted intervention. That evening, as Silas and Mildred prepared for sleep in the crude quarters Morrison had assigned them, both understood that they faced a crisis that would test every aspect of their training and partnership. They had to prevent or minimize the assault on Cedar Ridge while maintaining their cover deep enough to gather intelligence about Morrison's broader organization. Failure would mean not only their own deaths, but the deaths of innocent people they had sworn to protect. Their whispered conversation, conducted in a code that appeared to be marital intimacy but actually constituted tactical planning, established the framework for what would either be their greatest success as federal operatives or their final mission as anything at all. "The mirror," Mildred murmured against his shoulder. "Tomorrow's weather report needs to include storm warnings." Silas's arm tightened around her in what observers would interpret as affection, but which actually acknowledged his understanding of her plan to warn federal forces about the impending assault. "Timing will be critical," he replied in the same intimate tone. "Too early and we lose credibility. Too late and people die unnecessarily." They were two federal agents posing as criminals who were pretending to be a married couple, while actually being a married couple whose partnership had become the foundation for everything they hoped to achieve. The complexity would have been overwhelming if not for the trust they had built during their brief but intense time together. Outside their rough shelter, Morrison's sentries maintained careful watch over approaches to the stronghold, while the criminal leader himself planned an assault that would demonstrate the obsolescence of territorial law enforcement. Inside, two people who had found unexpected love while serving their country prepared to risk everything they had built together in service of protecting innocent lives and preserving the kind of justice that made civilization possible in harsh frontier conditions. The final confrontation was less than 24 hours away, and success would require perfect coordination between two people who had learned to trust each other completely despite having known each other for less than 2 months. Dawn was still hours away when they would begin the most dangerous day of their professional lives, but neither slept. Instead, they held each other while mentally rehearsing the tactical sequences that would determine whether they lived to build the life they had discovered they both wanted more than anything else they had ever imagined. Dawn brought the kind of crystalline mountain morning that made the high country seem like paradise, until you remembered what kinds of devils could hide among the peaks. Mildred woke to find Silas already dressed, his movements carrying the controlled tension of someone preparing for combat that would determine far more than personal survival. The signal mirror lay on their rough table like an accusation, its polished surface reflecting early sunlight in ways that seemed to mock their desperate need for communication with federal forces who might or might not be positioned to respond to their warning. Morrison's assault on Cedar Ridge was scheduled to begin at noon, timed to catch the town during peak market day activity, when maximum disruption could be achieved with minimum organized resistance. Federal law enforcement would need at least 6 hours to coordinate any meaningful response, which meant their warning signal had to be sent before dawn to provide even minimal protection for the people they had sworn to defend. But sending the signal too early would alert Morrison's communication monitors to the possibility of betrayal, while waiting too long would render any federal response meaningless for civilian protection. Mildred checked their simple gold wedding ring one final time. its plain band now serving as the key component in a communication system so sophisticated that Morrison's technical specialists had never detected its true capabilities. The ring contained a small but precisely calibrated crystal that would modify the signal mirror's reflections in ways that embedded federal operational codes within. Apparently routine weather reports. Their message would inform federal commanders not only about the timing and target of Morrison's assault, but also about the size and capabilities of his criminal organization, the extent of foreign involvement, and the location of his mountain stronghold. Success would provide law enforcement with everything necessary to eliminate the most dangerous criminal enterprise in territorial history. Failure would result in the deaths of everyone they had known in Cedar Ridge, followed shortly by their own execution as exposed federal agents. "Time," Silas said quietly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt with unconscious readiness for violence that had become as natural as breathing during 15 years of frontier survival. They moved through Morrison's stronghold with the careful casualness of people conducting routine morning business while actually positioning themselves for the most critical intelligence transmission of their careers. The signal mirror's operation required line-of-sight communication with federal positions that might not even exist if their warnings had failed to reach proper authorities through previous channels. Mildred took position on a rocky outcrop that offered views of the valleys where federal forces would stage any response to Morrison's criminal activities. The signal mirror felt surprisingly heavy in her hands, its polished surface reflecting not just sunlight, but the accumulated weight of everything they were risking on a single desperate gamble. The coded message took less than 3 minutes to transmit, but those minutes felt like hours as she flashed precisely timed sequences that would either save lives or confirm Morrison's suspicions about their true loyalties. Federal agents throughout the territory would receive the intelligence simultaneously, but only if her technique was flawless, and Morrison's monitors failed to detect the embedded operational codes. When the transmission was complete, she rejoined Silas with the same casual manner they had maintained throughout their infiltration of Morrison's organization. Neither spoke about what they had just accomplished, but both understood that they had committed themselves irrevocably to a course of action that would either vindicate their mission or destroy them both. Morrison appeared within minutes of their return to the main camp, his timing suggesting either coincidence or surveillance that had detected their morning activities. "I trust you slept well," he said, with the kind of false joviality that masked careful observation of their reactions and behavior. "As well as can be expected before important work," Silas replied evenly. "Indeed, important work that will demonstrate capabilities your federal friends have consistently underestimated." The direct reference to their government connections struck like a physical blow, confirming that their cover had been compromised more completely than they had realized. Morrison knew exactly who they were and what they represented, but was allowing them to continue their deception for reasons that suddenly seemed far more sinister than simple overconfidence. "I'm not sure what you mean by federal friends," Mildred said carefully, maintaining her role despite growing certainty that Morrison had been manipulating them from their first meeting. Morrison's smile contained no warmth whatsoever. "My dear Mrs. McGraw, your professional qualifications were precisely why I arranged for your recruitment to my organization. Did you imagine that your marriage to a fellow federal agent was mere coincidence?" The revelation struck them both like artillery. Fire! Not only did Morrison know their true identities, but he had somehow manipulated their entire relationship from its beginning. Their marriage, their partnership, their growing love for each other. All of it had been orchestrated by the criminal leader for purposes they were only beginning to understand. "The question now," Morrison continued with obvious satisfaction at their shocked expressions, "is whether you continue serving federal interests that have consistently undervalued your capabilities, or embrace opportunities for advancement that make full use of your considerable talents. Silas felt rage building in his chest like pressure behind a dam, but his training prevented any outward display of emotion that might compromise whatever tactical advantages they still possessed. Beside him, Mildred maintained perfect composure, despite learning that their most intimate relationship had been manipulated by someone whose criminal ambitions extended far beyond anything they had imagined. "What kind of opportunities?" she asked with apparently genuine interest, while actually buying time to assess their tactical situation and available options. The kind that establish new forms of territorial authority when old forms prove inadequate. For frontier realities, Washington's approach to law enforcement has failed consistently to address criminal organizations with sufficient resources and intelligence to operate beyond traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Morrison gestured toward his sophisticated military installation as evidence supporting his political theories. "My organization represents evolution in territorial governance, private security services that provide actual protection rather than bureaucratic promises, economic development that benefits participants rather than distant politicians, and justice systems that respond to local conditions rather than abstract legal principles." His vision amounted to replacing federal authority with criminal enterprise disguised as private law enforcement, a transformation that would reduce frontier territories to feudal states controlled by whoever possessed sufficient violence to impose their will on helpless civilian populations. The Cedar Ridge operation serves as demonstration of these principles, Morrison continued. "Local authority will prove helpless to prevent our activities. Federal response will arrive too late to provide meaningful protection, and survivors will recognize the advantages of accommodation over futile resistance." The casual brutality of his planning made clear that Morrison intended the raid to terrorize, rather than simply rob the frontier community. Civilian casualties would not be avoided, but actively sought as proof that federal law enforcement could not protect the people it claimed to serve. "After Cedar Ridge acknowledges new realities," Morrison concluded, "other communities will follow suit without requiring similar demonstrations. Your knowledge of federal operations will prove invaluable in negotiating transitions that minimize unnecessary violence while establishing proper authority relationships." He was offering them positions as his lieutenants in return for betraying everything they had sworn to defend as federal agents. The choice between collaboration and execution was clear, but Morrison's confidence suggested he believed their response was predetermined by practical considerations that made moral qualms irrelevant. What he didn't understand was that Silas and Mildred McGraw had discovered something during their brief marriage that made death preferable to betraying either their principles or each other. Their partnership had created bonds stronger than any threats Morrison could devise, and those bonds would sustain them through whatever confrontation was about to occur. "How much time do we have to consider your offer?" Silas asked, with apparent reasonableness, while actually establishing timelines for tactical planning. "Until the Cedar Ridge operation concludes successfully. Your participation will demonstrate commitment to new loyalties, while refusal will indicate attachment to old ones that have outlived their usefulness." Morrison's ultimatum provided the clarity they needed to plan their response. They had perhaps 4 hours to prevent or minimize the assault on Cedar Ridge while eliminating the criminal organization that threatened territorial stability throughout the region. Success would require perfect coordination of their individual skills, flawless execution of tactics they were improvising without adequate preparation, and the kind of desperate courage that came only from fighting for something more important than personal survival. As Morrison dismissed them to prepare for the day's activities, Silas and Mildred walked calmly toward their assigned quarters, while actually beginning the final phase of their mission as federal agents and their first true test as partners who would either triumph together or die together. Their wedding ring had already transmitted intelligence that would bring federal forces into position to respond to Morrison's assault. Now they had to ensure that civilian casualties were minimized while gathering final intelligence about criminal operations that threatened the entire territorial system of law and order. The afternoon would determine whether their marriage had been manipulated by criminal enterprise or blessed by Providence with exactly the partnership necessary to preserve justice in a harsh frontier world. The sun was setting behind the western peaks when Silas and Mildred McGraw finally returned to their mountain cabin, carrying with them the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a partnership proven stronger than any force that had tried to destroy it. Cedar Ridge had been saved. Morrison's criminal organization had been eliminated. The foreign conspiracy to destabilize territorial authority had been exposed and defeated. Most importantly, their marriage had survived revelations and challenges that would have destroyed relationships built on less solid foundations. The federal response to their intelligence transmission had exceeded every expectation. Coordinated strikes on Morrison's stronghold and communication networks had dismantled the entire criminal enterprise within hours of the planned assault. On Cedar Ridge, Morrison himself had been captured alive, along with his foreign advisors, and enough documentation to expose similar operations throughout the Western Territories. The town that had once mocked their unlikely marriage now spoke of them with the kind of reverent admiration reserved for heroes whose sacrifices had saved innocent lives. Children who had once scattered at Silas's approach now waved eagerly when they spotted him in the distance. Women who had once dismissed Mildred as a plain spinster now sought her advice about everything from medical care to matters of the heart. But the most significant transformation had occurred within their own relationship. Learning that their marriage had been manipulated by criminal conspiracy had initially shaken their confidence in what they had built together. If their attraction had been orchestrated, their compatibility manufactured, their love merely the product of elaborate deception, what did that say about the reality of their partnership? The answer had come during the final confrontation with Morrison's forces, when each had risked everything to protect the other without thought for mission objectives or federal priorities. Whatever had brought them together, what they had created transcended its origins to become something genuine and unshakable. People are still talking about the wedding, Mildred observed as she arranged wildflowers in a jar that had once held medical supplies but now served purely decorative purposes. Let them talk, Silas replied from his position beside the fireplace, where he was cleaning his father's rifle with the same methodical care it had received for 3 generations. This time, they're talking about something worth discussing, outside. Their cabin, the same mountains that had concealed criminal conspiracy, now offered the kind of peace that came from having faced the worst possible challenges and emerged stronger rather than broken. Their love story had become legend throughout the territory, but the legend mattered less to them than the daily reality of partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of trust that made each more effective than either could. Be alone. A new wooden sign hung beside their front door, hand-carved with simple elegance that reflected Silas's craftsmanship and Mildred's sense of design. McGraw Ranch, it proclaimed to any visitor who might find their way to this remote valley, announcing their intention to build something permanent together rather than merely surviving in temporary isolation. The federal government had offered both of them continued employment in covert operations that would utilize their proven effectiveness as a team. They had declined, choosing instead to establish the kind of life they had discovered they wanted, more than professional achievement or public recognition. Their mountain ranch would provide the peace they had earned through service that had cost them both more than anyone would ever know. but it would also serve as a refuge for other federal agents who needed time to recover from missions that tested the limits of human endurance, and as a training ground for couples whose partnerships might prove valuable to territorial law enforcement. Do you ever regret it? Mildred asked as they prepared for sleep in the bedroom that had once been hers alone, but was now truly theirs. Giving up the work that defined both of us for so many years? Silas considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to all matters that affected their shared future. I regret nothing that brought me to this moment with you. Whatever we were before, we're better together than either of us was alone. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their individual identities as federal agents had been important, but their joint identity as partners in marriage and life transcended professional accomplishments to create something that would last beyond any mission or assignment. The plain seamstress and the mountain man had indeed shocked everyone who thought they knew what such people were capable of achieving. But the greatest shock had been to themselves, as they discovered that love could find the most unlikely people and transform them into something stronger than they had ever imagined possible. As autumn settled over their mountain valley with colors that seemed painted by an artist who understood that beauty came in infinite varieties, Silas and Mildred McGraw began building the life they had risked everything to protect. Their love story would be remembered long after the criminal conspiracy they had defeated was forgotten. But they measured success not by public acclaim, but by the quiet satisfaction of partnership that had proven equal to every challenge. The mountains that had once seemed forbidding now felt like home. The isolation that had once been refuge now became the foundation for building something that would last through whatever challenges the future might bring. And the marriage that had begun as apparent mismatch had revealed itself to be the kind of perfect partnership that proved genuine love could indeed find the most unexpected people and transform them into exactly what each other needed most. Inner, a land where survival required strength, wisdom, and the courage to see beyond surface appearances. They had found each other and created something that would endure long after the gossips were forgotten, and the doubters had learned the truth about recognizing real worth when it appeared in unexpected forms. Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot, and love finds us in the most unexpected places. For Silas and Mildred McGraw, that truth had become the foundation of a life together that exceeded every dream either had dared imagine during the lonely years before they discovered that the right partnership could indeed make anything possible. Chatidea, mountain man, and his bride had proven that true beauty comes not from appearance, but from character, courage, and the kind of love that sees worth where others see only surface flaws. Their story became a reminder that in a world quick to judge by appearances, the most extraordinary partnerships often develop between the most unlikely people. Years later, when travelers passed through Cedar Ridge and heard the tale of Silas and Mildred McGraw, they would shake their heads in amazement at how wrong an entire town could be about two people who seemed so mismatched. But those who had witnessed the transformation, who had seen the plain seamstress reveal strength that saved lives and watched the fearsome mountain man demonstrate tenderness that honored his wife's true worth, understood that some love stories transcend every expectation to create something more beautiful than any fairy tale. In their mountain home, as winter snows covered the peaks and spring flowers returned to the valleys, Mr. and Mrs. McGraw continued building the kind of partnership that proved love could indeed conquer all, not through magic or miracles, but through the daily choice to see the best in each other and work together toward shared dreams that honored both their individual strengths and their combined possibilities. The mockery had become admiration, the doubt had become respect, and the unlikely marriage had become the kind of enduring love story that reminded everyone who heard it that true worth often comes disguised as something the world overlooks until someone wise enough to look deeper discovers the treasure that was always there, waiting for recognition, and in the end, that recognition, first by each other, then by their community, and finally by history itself, proved that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest truth, that the right person will see you exactly as you are and love you not despite your imperfections, but because of the unique combination of strength, wisdom, and heart that makes you exactly who they need most in this world.